Get us the fuck out of here, I shouted, foot stomping for the gas pedal I wished I had in the back. Frank sweated against the blaring heater from the dash as he wrangled the beefy ride in contradiction to the slick roads, but they had us hedged in on winding curves that bordered on perilous even in prime weather. The ass end of our SUV wagged to one side, forcing the impinging truck to counter, so we lurched ahead, but there wasn't even a breakdown lane to use for cushion. Nothing for miles aside from a scenic overlook marked on the in-dash GPS map Frank gestured to in frustration. The fuck you want me to do? We're trapped out here until we reach an off-ramp. The portly guy, who couldn't have passed one of the marshal's physicals if his life depended on it, crawled back to me, then practically piled onto my lap en route to the seat behind the driver. We'd barely untangled ourselves when our ride whipped to one side, sending him sliding toward the floorboard and plowing me into the door. He slammed the back of the front seat with the palm of his free hand. Jesus, Mary, and their holy golf cart, Frank! Slow down! I can't get a bead with you jerking us on and off the shoulder. I yanked off my seatbelt, then slid over to give him room. At least there wasn't space on my side of the vehicle for our attackers to flank us with anything but a motorbike and a death wish. When Lou thumbed the button to lower the window, I winced against a blast of frosty air. He shoved the barrel of his service weapon through the gap. The crack of release made my ears ring, but there was no sign his shot made impact. I pressed myself low, waiting for their response, but none came. A sign marking a hairpin turn in the road ahead popped out of the black void of night beyond the sheet of snow. Lou tapped the brakes in violent repetitions. Shit. I clung to the front edge of the seat and the door handle, heartbeat punching my ear canals like it had finally found an escape route and was eager to get on with it. We fishtailed around the corner, sliding close enough to the rail that my prostate clenched at the sight of the precipitous drop. Frank hit the accelerator, the car lurched forward, and the rear bumper threw sparks as it dragged the edge of the guardrail. The SUV that dropped back before entering the turn nosed our back corner, shoving us into the rocky embankment. The passenger side quarter panel buckled on impact, and we jerked to an abrupt halt that flung me to the floorboard. Not a heartbeat later, Frank emitted a muffled grunt when the airbag deployed. He was still fighting the cursed safety measure when his side window smashed in and someone shoved a pistol in his face. No matter how many times I played the scene in my head, I'd never understand how he angled his piece enough with an airbag-filled cab to blast the gunman's face into a red mess before his adversary could get a shot off. Frank had killer instincts. I had to respect that. "Stay put!" Lou yelled. My gaze shot to Frank, then to Lou, then to the shadowy figures approaching in the snow, and despite my military training, I wasn't good with following instructions, especially when my ass was hanging out. I scrambled out the passenger side into the narrow gap between the back door and the rock wall, slipping on the icy roadway until I was certain I'd face plant. Before my feet could go out from under me, I dropped onto the meaty muscles of my forearms to break my fall, then wriggled under the SUV. Crawling on the icy cold asphalt and snow, I prayed to whatever deity might reside above that no one noticed me bailing out. The vehicles had us pinned in and triangulated against the embankment, and despite the two they'd lost off the bat, they enjoyed superior numbers. I longed for a weapon as I hugged the ice in the narrow space beneath the car. I'd practically begged my protection detail for a piece, but all I got was policy this and policy that. Funny how policy applied to the ones most likely to suffer from it. Lou and Frank returned fire from above. The night morphed into a confusion of shouts and muffled cracks in the sharp glare of headlights and deep shadows. Chiaroscuro, they called it in art, an unbidden remembrance I shoved from my consciousness lest I got lead aerated. Someone shot out the tires on both sides and the SUV sank. Time to scurry. I wormed through the snow to the front of the vehicle with intent, then slid backward into a pool of blood. A few desperate kicks later, I got to my knees in front of the SUV's grill to find Frank's blasted face staring at me through a mask of red tissue and shattered bone. I suppressed the curse that touched the back of my lips. My hand brushed cold steel. When I groped for it in the snow, then clutched his 9, it was like coming home. Spare magazines waited in his coat pocket. With my back pressed against the cold front bumper, I drew deep, slow breaths, willing my heart to slow as I had from so many ridges in Kashmir and Pakistan. Adrenaline had its time, and it wasn't when triggers needed pulling, especially when I already shivered against the cold. I worked my way with cautious, crouched steps, wary of the ice. Then I ducked beneath the headlight lest I cast a shadow. Before I could peek around the corner to assess enemy positions, a voice shouted over the wind, "Give it up, Jacobs! Uncle Gianni just wants to talk!" Despite the hard blow creating a cold tunnel in my ears, I'd heard that voice enough times to pick it out at a metal concert. Vance, nephew of the Don, figured they'd send him. They sure as shit weren't going to send the suns out in that frosty nightmare. I wondered if it even occurred to Vance how disposable he was. I considered calling out to him, maybe trying to get into his head, but I'd betray my position, so I bit my tongue. Vance was as close to a friend as a betrayer working for the feds could get. The question of whether he'd pop me given the chance didn't even register. The family handled betrayal in a consistent, universal, and final fashion. They whacked fucks. His was the only figure I saw lurking, but that didn't mean much. Situational readiness demanded the assumption there was always at least one more, and that philosophy had saved my pork rinds enough times I wasn't about to test it. Idle engines grumbled in a low hum beneath the wind, and wiper blades squeaked as they brushed feebly at the thickening precipitation. The noise would provide cover against my feet crunching snow, but I froze. Listened. I wasn't dealing with military types. To these guys, tactics applied only when they had a map and a lot of time to plan. Improvisation was stopping for a spontaneous cold one on the ride home because Vance saw a nice pair of legs on the sidewalk. "Come on, buddy. No one else would give a shit what happens to you now. But we've got a history. We did things together. I don't think you did anything they say. That would be illegal, yeah? Entrapment. So let's go straighten this out with my uncle. It's freezing out here." When I didn't answer, Vance crouched next to the SUV and duck-walked with his head tilted to one side, probably trying to use the line of sight beneath to spot my legs. But they were shielded by Frank's body. When he pivoted to check the opposite end of the ride, suspecting I might have changed positions, I huffed 2 quick breaths, whipped around the corner, vaulted over the corpse Frank left outside the open driver's door, then took a sliding leap at Vance. Our feet slid out from under us on the ice. His chin cracked pavement. I used the moment while he was dazed to slip the muzzle of my gun against the back of his head. He groaned. My chin came up as I checked for other signs of life. Nothing. Lou and Frank had stepped up, but that didn't mean there were no stragglers lurking out there, even if they didn't make themselves noticed. I shoved the barrel against Vance's neck to reinforce the idea he shouldn't get stupid. Despite my earlier thoughts about adrenaline, my finger quivered against the trigger in a way that had nothing to do with the frigid air. Images flooded my mind. All the times we had one too many together, how we cracked wise at women at the club, all role play. But in the moment, no matter how I gathered the gumption to do a piece of business I longed to have done, the training kicked in. It wasn't personal. Well, getting my ass shot at was a little personal. But I'd played the part, gotten Vance to spill vital intel, come within inches of getting popped for my trouble, then made tracks. I shook my head. This whole thing was fucked up. All of it. The whole escapade seemed like a constant stream of sewage. This is one of those times you should be grateful I'm not one of you goons. But here's a little message for your uncle. Come at me again, and I'll leave enough bodies to fill the cemetery behind that church he pollutes with his disingenuous presence every Sunday. As of now, I'm in the wind. You assholes play your cards right, and I'll leave you alone. I leaned so my cold lips brushed one earlobe. Screw with me, and I'll plant you like a root vegetable. I drew back, then pistol-whipped the base of his skull. Vance rattled before falling flat beneath me. I scanned the area, trying to get a body count. Not that I knew precisely how many rode along with the other team, but habits died hard. When I edged along the side of the least damaged SUV, I spied the one Frank had hip-shot trying to slide away behind the car. My whole disposition changed when I realized who it was. Terry, one of the Don's hitmen. No matter how many times the Bureau dragged his backside into the system, nothing stuck. He slid off like hot butter on ice. In my mind, I saw body count. The images of men with neat little .22 holes in their foreheads, behind their ears. And if the Don really disliked them, They got the basement treatment on their genitals. Now this one is what I call justice. Terry dragged himself along like he had a blueberries chance in a blender, but I wasn't about to drag it out. I leaned over the open door and shot him again, this time in the center of his chest. When I whipped around, I was reminded of Frank's demise as he hunched against the front bumper, but there was no sign of his partner. Lou! Lou! Hey! I went back to the SUV and looked in the open back door. He was crumpled half on the seat, half on the floor, blood painting his shirt from several entry wounds. It leaked all over the heated leather. My protection detail, toast. The SUV crumpled with a bent axle. Someone had flipped up the back gate to the hold and the bags were scattered all over the snow, clothes blowing around in the frosty gales. So much for that. My duds were indistinctive by design. Casual. But the bloodstains I'd slid through beneath the marshal's vehicle wouldn't do. I found someone about my size laying on the asphalt and snow, and I checked his suit for blood or holes. He'd taken one in the temple. No exit wound. It was a miracle his shirt wasn't drenched, but most of the Red River hadn't penetrated his jacket. I sent silent thanks to the universe for shoulder pads. I shivered as I requisitioned his jacket, paranoid the whole time that someone might roll up and discover this gory scene before I could make tracks. Time ticked in my head, counting down to when a check-in call would be missed, to when another team might be dispatched. While I didn't want the Javorskis getting another go at me, I was done with the whole fiasco. Enough was enough. While I mourned the loss of a couple decent guys whose mission was to keep my heart beating, it was done. I gathered weapons, relieved a few wallets of their cash, and surveyed the options for a getaway. One car's front end steamed like a dragon, so I peeled off in the truck one of the Don's guys had been driving, rolling back in the direction from which we'd come. Chapter 3. Bad enough my hands jittered with adrenaline despite the end of the firefight, but the way that truck slid all over the road, I'd have taken Frank's driving any day. I guess the bad guys didn't splurge on chains like my team. The wipers struggled to clear the thickening snow, and I was hardly able to see the road ahead even with them going double time. At least the heater pumped out tropical breezes. Something clattered across the dash as I slewed around a corner, and I snagged it when it hurtled over the side. A lucky catch. I tossed it into the passenger's seat so I could focus as I slowed on a straightaway, rolling carefully until I could pull over somewhere without getting stuck. Hopefully my lights would keep anyone from plowing into me while I took a sec to examine the device. No contacts, and a one-call history. A burner. Finally, some luck. My last bit if I didn't get off those damned roads. I tapped the wheel with the tips of my fingers until the number I needed slid into my brain matter. It rang through to voicemail as expected. Skyhawk, I muttered, then disconnected the call. I kept south down the mountain, watching for any turnoffs clear enough where I could tuck away and preserve fuel in case I had a long trek ahead. Half a tank. Although it was colder than a witch's tit doing push-ups on an iceberg in the Arctic, I'd have to cut the engine and suffer it. There, a snowy side road. I skidded in sideways, then eased the nose around to point toward the main road so I could keep an eye on things. I'd cranked the engine again once the cabin grew insufferable, but I was in conservation mode for the time being. In a second lucky stroke, when was the last time I enjoyed back-to-back moments, the burner had 3 bars. The touchscreen on the dash lit up when I tapped it, so I checked the truck's setup to keep myself occupied. Old tech. Not much interesting. GPS was disabled, so they'd stolen it. No great shock. Any teenager trying to evade parental tracking could pull that off. An hour passed. I cleared the windshield once with a brush laying in the back, but getting out let in cold air, so I just used the wipers next time the snow piled too high to see out. I gave in and ran the engine a few times for warmth when tucking my hands under my armpits and huddling stopped doing the job. Too macho for mittens, my mother once called me. The fuel gauge ticked lower each time I sought warmth, so I shut off the engine with a promise to my gonads that I'd warm them up again in a while. I about jumped out of my frozen socks when the burner chimed and vibrated, doing the jitterbug across the dash in front of me. When I snatched for it, the damned thing rattled to the floorboard, and I had to finger crawl beneath the accelerator to recover it. My heart tried to leap out of my chest as I fretted over whether I'd accidentally end the call. A familiar voice on the other end erupted. Skyhawk? Dude, where the hell you been?